The dawn of desperation, a strategic dead end. The year is 1944. For the Empire of Japan, the strategic situation is no longer grim, it is catastrophic. The vast territorial gains of 1941 and 1942 have been systematically peeled away by the relentless American island-hopping campaign. The Imperial Japanese Navy has been decimated at Midway and Leyte Gulf. The skies over Japan are now being penetrated by the colossal B-29 superfortress, launching devastating bombing raids that torch Japanese cities and dismantle its manufacturing base. Japan is under siege, and conventional offensive options against the U.S. mainland are non-existent. The logistical and naval pathways across the 5,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean have been completely severed. Tokyo requires a miracle, a weapon that can strike the American continent, disrupt the civilian psyche, and most importantly, deliver a message of terror without risking a single ship or aircraft. The solution was as improbable as it was desperate: the Fu-Go balloon bomb. This story, the tale of the fire balloons, is not just about a bizarre weapon. It is about the ultimate technical gambit born of strategic desperation and the exploitation of a natural phenomenon that had been, until then, a mere curiosity. The scientific breakthrough, the discovery of the jet stream. The Japanese needed a delivery system that could cross the Pacific Ocean without consuming fuel or being intercepted by the U.S. Navy. The answer lay not in metallurgy or propulsion, but in meteorology. In 1942, Japanese meteorologist Lieutenant Colonel Wasaburo Oishi confirmed the existence and reliability of a phenomenon previously only theorized: the jet stream. This swift, narrow current of air, flowing from west to east at altitudes between 30,000 and 38,000 feet, could reach speeds of up to 200 miles per hour, or 320 kilometers per hour. Oishi's team calculated that a buoyant object carried within this massive, high-altitude river of air could make the trans-Pacific journey in approximately 72 to 100 hours, a technological shortcut that rendered the vast distance irrelevant. This discovery was the foundational science of the Fu-Go project, turning an atmospheric anomaly into a weapon delivery system. The challenge of the envelope: crafting the airship. The primary technical challenge became designing an envelope, the airship itself, capable of 1. Lifting a payload of bombs and mechanisms, 2. Surviving the extreme cold and pressure of the stratosphere, and 3. Being produced cheaply and in enormous volume. The typical gas bag material, rubberized silk, was too expensive and too scarce due to the American blockade. The solution was ingenious, labor-intensive, and quintessentially Japanese: washi paper. Material and construction. The balloons were constructed of 3 or 4 layers of high-quality, durable washi paper sourced from the mulberry bush. These sheets were carefully glued together using a potent vegetable-based paste made from konnyaku, devil's tongue. The finished balloons measured approximately 33 feet or 10 meters in diameter, and when inflated, held nearly 19,000 cubic feet or 540 cubic meters of hydrogen gas. Production scale. The manufacturing process was a massive collective undertaking involving over 10,000 workers, primarily high school students and women, who worked in shifts in giant gymnasiums and paper factories. The sheets had to be handled carefully to avoid tears and to ensure the glue dried evenly, creating an airtight, lightweight, and surprisingly robust material. The success of the paper envelope was a testament to both Japanese craftsmanship and the desperate necessity to find non-strategic materials for a strategic weapon. The technical marvel: the ballast system. The most complex and critical piece of technology was the altitude control system. For the balloon to remain in the jet stream, it couldn't simply be released. It needed to maintain a specific altitude in a dynamic, high-altitude environment. As the sun rose, the hydrogen gas would heat up and expand, causing the balloon to gain altitude. As the sun set, the gas would cool and contract, causing the balloon to sink. If the balloon rose too high, it would burst. If it sank too low, it would be caught by lower-level westerly winds and blown back towards Japan or simply fall out of the jet stream. The Japanese solution was a masterpiece of electromechanical engineering. The barometric altimeter. A sensitive barometric altimeter was rigged to detect when the balloon dropped below its target altitude, around 30,000 feet. The power source. The altimeter was connected to a cluster of batteries and a small firing mechanism. The ballast drop. When the balloon descended, the altimeter would trigger an electrical spark. This spark would ignite a small fuse that would sever a rope, dropping a 3-pound, 1.4-kilogram sandbag attached to the balloon's rigging. The cycle. This process would be repeated up to 32 times. The Fugo balloon carried 32 total sandbags, ensuring it could maintain the correct altitude for 3 to 5 days, the estimated time for the trans-Pacific crossing. Once the final ballast bag was dropped, the balloon was designed to trigger its explosive payload. The payload, fire and incendiaries. The destructive capacity of the Fugo was deliberately limited. Since the mechanism could only carry a certain weight, the bombs were intended not for high explosive destruction, but for psychological terror and incendiary disruption, specifically starting massive forest fires to divert American manpower and resources to firefighting efforts. The total payload weighed around 15 kilograms and typically consisted of one 15-kilogram, 33-pound high-explosive anti-personnel bomb, and 4 5-kilogram, 11-pound incendiary devices or thermite bombs designed to start brush fires. Crucially, after all the ballast was dropped and the bombs were released, a final fuse would ignite a small self-destruct charge to destroy the paper envelope and the complex rigging system, ensuring the technology would not fall into American hands for analysis. The launch, a desperate gambit. The first wave of balloons was launched in November 1944. The launches were massive, secretive operations conducted from sites primarily near the east coast of Honshu, Japan. The balloons were inflated with hydrogen, their ballast systems checked, and then released in the thousands, relying on the predictable currents of the jet stream to carry them across the vast ocean. The Japanese military's goal was twofold: economic disruption, start uncontrolled forest fires across the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, to force the U.S. to divert critical wartime manpower and resources to firefighting efforts, and psychological warfare, cause widespread fear and panic among the American civilian population by forcing the deployment of anti-aircraft defenses and emergency services against an invisible, silent, and untraceable enemy.
To describe the massive, secretive deployment of the Fugo balloons and, crucially, the immediate aggressive censorship enacted by the U.S. government that prevented the Japanese from verifying the attack's success. 1. The deployment, a campaign of thousands. Following the successful technical validation, Act 1, the Japanese military initiated the main launch phase, aiming for massive psychological impact through sheer volume. This was an overwhelming blind strike designed to blanket the western half of the American continent. Massive scale. Beginning in November 1944 and continuing until the spring of 1945, the Japanese launched an estimated 9,300 Fugo balloons across the Pacific. The launch crews worked in shifts, battling harsh winter weather along the coast of Honshu, carefully inflating the paper envelopes with hydrogen and checking the complex ballast mechanisms. The unseen armada. This was a silent, continuous invasion. The balloons traveled high above the weather, entirely invisible to human eyes and radar, until they began their final descent, making interception virtually impossible. The Japanese had committed an enormous amount of resources, time, labor, and hydrogen gas to a weapon they could only hope was reaching its target. 2. The first sightings. Terror on the home front. By late 1944 and early 1945, the first balloons began to appear over North America. These were not the high-altitude instruments of Act I. These were the spent, descending envelopes, rigging, and bombs. Widespread discoveries. Balloons or fragments were found scattered across a vast geographical area, from Alaska to northern Mexico, and as far east as Michigan. Sightings were reported in 26 different U.S. states and several Canadian provinces. Initial panic and confusion. To the public, these devices were bizarre, often gigantic, and utterly foreign objects carrying unknown explosives. Initial theories ranged from accidental weather balloons to new Soviet spy devices. The public reaction ranged from curiosity to localized panic, particularly when unexploded ordnance was found near farms and towns. 3. The American response. Operation Firefly. The U.S. military and intelligence services quickly recognized the scale of the threat. The possibility that these balloons could carry biological or chemical weapons or simply ignite uncontrollable forest fires in the arid Pacific Northwest was terrifying. The entire response effort, codename Operation Firefly, was immediately launched. The firefighter force. Thousands of troops, including the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, known as the Triple Nickels, an all-black smoke jumper unit, were deployed to the Pacific Northwest to train specifically in combating balloon-ignited forest fires. Intelligence gathering. Every single component recovered, paper samples, wires, sandbag contents, and especially the ballast weights, was immediately analyzed. Through chemical analysis of the sand, Act 7, U.S. scientists determined the exact beach locations in Japan where the sand had been collected, providing crucial targeting intelligence. 4. The Wall of Silence. Strategic censorship. The most critical and effective countermeasure was not military but psychological and informational. Absolute press censorship. The problem. The Japanese only knew the campaign was working if they received reports via shortwave radio or U.S. newspapers confirming that the balloons were causing damage. The solution. The Office of Censorship immediately issued a directive banning all mention of the balloons, fragments, sightings, or damage in the media. This included newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even local police reports. The official story was that the incidents were all natural phenomena or weather-related. The effect. The censorship was overwhelmingly successful. The American press cooperated almost perfectly, protecting the secret for months. Unable to determine if their ingenious, massive effort was succeeding or if the balloons were simply falling into the ocean, the Japanese military, based purely on the lack of American reports, eventually concluded the campaign was a failure and curtailed the launches in the spring of 1945. The campaign was effectively defeated by a strategic information blackout.
To move the narrative from the strategic secrecy of the launch, Act 2, to the stark reality of the balloon's impact on North American soil, focusing on the single, tragic incident of civilian death and the constant, unnerving danger the unseen weapons posed to the populace and the war effort. 1. The unseen threat, a continent under siege. Despite the press blackout, Act 2, the presence of the Fugao bombs became an undeniable, unsettling reality across the vast stretches of the American and Canadian West. These were not singular, isolated events, but continuous, random intrusions that made every piece of remote landscape a potential danger zone. Randomized terror. The balloons followed no predictable path once they descended from the jet stream. They landed on beaches, in deserts, high in the Rocky Mountains, and occasionally near suburban homes. This randomness meant that every single piece of recovered debris, every strange piece of paper found, had to be treated as a potential explosive device. The military was constantly scrambling, often disguised as civilian personnel, to recover wreckage before news could leak to the press, or worse, before an unsuspecting civilian stumbled upon an unexploded bomb. Economic sabotage. While the Japanese primary goal of starting massive, uncontrollable firestorms was mitigated by a wet winter in the Pacific Northwest, the threat was still severe. The discovery of balloons near critical infrastructure, such as the Hanford site in Washington, where plutonium for the atomic bomb was being produced, led to immediate and costly shutdowns. The possibility of an incendiary device triggering a massive blaze at a logging camp, a munitions depot, or a vital factory forced the diversion of thousands of personnel and immense resources, validating a key part of Japan's original psychological and economic warfare strategy. 2. The tragedy of Bly, Oregon, the single fatal strike. The success of the censorship policy, Act 2, was maintained at enormous cost. In early May 1945, near the small logging town of Bly, Oregon, the human cost of the Fugao campaign became tragically evident in the only incident in which the Japanese balloons claimed lives. The scene. On May 5, 1945, Reverend Archie Mitchell, his pregnant wife Elsie Mitchell, and 5 young children from their Sunday school class set out for a picnic and fishing trip near Gearhart Mountain. The discovery. Reverend Mitchell parked their car and walked ahead to set up the picnic. Elsie and the children, walking behind him, stumbled upon a large, white object on the ground near a small clearing, the paper remnants and rigging of a spent Fugao balloon. Out of curiosity, or perhaps thinking it was harmless debris, one of the children, or Elsie herself, disturbed the mechanism or the bomb's wiring. The explosion was devastating. Elsie Mitchell and all 5 children, Edward Engen, Richard Potsky, Joan Potsky, Dick Potsky, and Sherman Shoemaker, were instantly killed by the high-explosive anti-personnel bomb. Reverend Archie Mitchell, who was within earshot, rushed back to discover the incomprehensible tragedy. The classified aftermath. The U.S. military immediately descended on Bly. The site was cordoned off, the remains of the children and Elsie were recovered, and a massive effort was launched to conceal the truth. The military informed the local community that the deaths were caused by an explosion of unknown origin, continuing the blackout to prevent mass panic, particularly in the critical final months of the war. 3. Censorship under strain. The silence breaks. The Bly incident placed enormous pressure on the Office of Censorship. A funeral for 6 people killed by a mysterious foreign weapon could not be easily ignored. The plea. Military leaders in the Office of War Information debated intensely. They knew that revealing the truth would validate the Japanese campaign, potentially encouraging them to resume or increase the launches, possibly using chemical or biological agents next. The compromise. The military decided to release a carefully worded, vague press advisory that alluded to the discovery of Japanese incendiary balloons and confirmed that there had been a tragic accident. However, they simultaneously published a plea to the American press and the public, stressing that any further reporting on the discovery, location, or nature of the balloons would directly aid the enemy and potentially lead to more deaths. Patriotism prevailed. Remarkably, the press, understanding the grave implications for national security, continued their voluntary censorship. Stories of the Bly tragedy were largely suppressed or downplayed, and the public remained largely unaware of the true extent of the silent invasion. This act of collective patriotic silence saved the secrecy of the campaign, though it left communities like Bly bewildered and grieving in silence. 4. The unseen threat lingers. The Grand Canyon connection. The Bly tragedy was the single confirmed lethal incident, but the balloons continued to descend, landing in some of the most remote and iconic locations across the American West, including national parks. The random landings, balloons or their potentially armed components, were officially logged as landing in locations like the Grand Canyon National Park, Utah's mountains, and remote Canadian wilderness areas. These incidents never resulted in mass panic because they were quickly recovered or their discovery was isolated. The danger persists. Even after Japan surrendered in August 1945, the threat was not eliminated. The paper balloons, being relatively durable, and their explosive components, being chemically stable, simply lay dormant.
The military spent years afterward hunting for unexploded ordnance. The legacy of the Fugo campaign is that to this day, unrecovered, armed Japanese balloon bombs are theorized to exist deep within the vast, remote forests and parks of the North American continent. A silent, volatile reminder of the war's strangest campaign.
To conclude the story of the Fugo campaign by assessing its ultimate failure against American strategy, detailing the immediate post-war cleanup efforts, and explaining why the threat of unexploded ordnance remains a bizarre historical anomaly in North America. 1. The strategic failure, a campaign defeated by silence. Despite the extraordinary technical ingenuity and massive commitment of resources, the Fugo campaign achieved virtually none of its major strategic objectives, largely due to the successful censorship campaign, Act 2. The ignored success. The Japanese only managed to inflict one instance of confirmed civilian fatality, the tragic event in Bly, Oregon, Act 3. They failed to trigger the widespread panic necessary to divert significant military resources from Europe or the Pacific. The U.S. successfully protected the public from knowing the extent of the attacks, robbing the Japanese military of the psychological payoff they desperately sought. The unchecked industrial machine. The primary goal of starting massive forest fires to cripple the Pacific Northwest's vital logging and defense industries was averted, partially by a damp winter and primarily by the rapid deployment of Operation Firefly and the Triple Nickels, smoke jumpers. American industrial capacity remained untouched and functional, continuing to churn out the materials that would ultimately bring Japan to its knees. Wasted resources. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army, or IJA, was forced to conclude that the massive logistical effort, the 9,300 balloons, the hydrogen gas, the specialized paper, and the labor of over 10,000 citizens had been for nothing. The campaign was formally ended due to the lack of confirming intelligence, marking a catastrophic misallocation of valuable materials and manpower at a time when Japan was fighting for its very existence. The silence of the American press was in effect a highly successful, non-violent counterattack. 2. The post-war cleanup, hunting ghosts. When the war ended in August 1945, the danger from the Fugo balloons did not immediately cease. While the launching ceased, the United States was left with the unsettling reality that thousands of unexploded armed devices were scattered across the remote, forested, and mountainous regions of the continent. Public reveal. Immediately after Japan's surrender, the U.S. government finally released the full story of the balloon bombs. The revelation of the long-held secret created a sensation, but also a new type of panic, as civilians realized the strange fragments they had encountered months earlier might have been active bombs. The deactivation campaign. The military initiated a massive 10-year cleanup effort, particularly in the western states and Canadian provinces. Teams of ordnance experts were deployed to areas of known or suspected landings. The initial goal was to recover the devices, render them safe, and educate the public on identifying the paper fragments, the rigging, and the sandbag remnants. The risk. Even with dedicated teams, the sheer size of the target zone, literally half a continent, meant that thousands would simply never be found. Many landed in areas so remote that human presence was negligible. Furthermore, the paper envelopes were surprisingly resilient. Protected from direct sun and moisture, the chemical components of the bombs remained volatile. Experts and bomb disposal units occasionally field calls related to finding aged, suspicious fragments in remote areas, a strange echo of the 1944-1945 campaign. 3. The Grand Canyon anomaly, the lingering legacy. The ultimate fate of the unrecovered balloons creates a unique, enduring historical mystery, lending credence to the initial fascination implied by the video's title. Uncertainty in wilderness. While many were found in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, others drifted much farther inland before their altitude mechanisms failed. Official military logs confirm that Fugo components were recovered in areas near Grand Canyon National Park, suggesting that the balloons were capable of penetrating deep into the American interior. The dormant threat. The final legacy of the campaign lies in the persistent, though minimal risk that the hydrogen pressure or a simple change in humidity could trigger the highly reliable detonators on a still-armed device. Experts and bomb disposal units occasionally field calls related to finding aged, suspicious fragments in remote areas, a strange echo of the 1944-1945 campaign. a symbol of desperation. The Fugo campaign is remembered as one of the most unique and desperate acts of the war. It represents a technological masterpiece born of ultimate strategic failure. The Japanese demonstrated immense scientific adaptability, finding and using the jet stream, and industrial craftsmanship, the paper balloons, but they were ultimately defeated by the superiority of American strategic intelligence, censorship, and the resilience of the American home front.